I'm David Laws. I'm a member of the California Garden and Landscape History Society. Welcome to another in our series of interviews with people involved with helping to protect, preserve, restore, and promote knowledge of California's historic gardens and landscapes. It's May the 27th, 2021, and today I'll be talking with David Streatfield. David is Emeritus Professor of Landscape Architecture and Urban Design and Planning at the University of Washington in Seattle. Born in England, he has a long and distinguished career in the teaching and practice of landscape architecture in the United States. A prolific author, David is probably best known to members of CGLHS for his 1994 book, California Gardens, Creating a New Eden. So, welcome, David. Thank you for joining us today. And I'd like to we'll go through in a chronological order, but feel free to interject with comments and other items that come to your mind as we go along. Let's start out with your childhood and your family. Where were you born, and tell us a little bit about your family?
I was born in Hove in Sussex, technically in East Sussex. And Hove is a 19th century town which adjoins Brighton. And when I was born, it was a separate town. It's now joined with Brighton. I was an only child of two warm, loving parents, Claude and Eileen Streatfield. And when I was 3 years old, my father's mother died. And at that point, there was a family mini drama. And the question was, what's going to happen to Grandpa? So Grandpa came to live with us. And during the war, this was a really fortunate thing because my father served in the Royal Army Service Corps and was away in Belgium and northern France from about 1940 until 1945. So Grandpa was effectively my father during the war. And I have wonderfully warm memories of him. We used to go to church every Sunday at All Saints Parish Church in Hove, which is a magnificent cathedral-like building. And the rector at that time was a retired Australian bishop, Dr. Horace Crotty. And Dr. Horace Crotty was a Churchillian figure, rather portly, with a magnificent stentorian voice, who gave really magnificent sermons. And it was a church that was slightly on the Anglo-Catholic end of the Episcopal Church. And so on high days and holidays, he would put on all his bishop's regalia, and there would be processions through the church. And I think one of the things, I think that played an important role in my life, because it developed a strong interest in theatrical issues. And I took acting lessons. And I really wanted to be an actor. That was my great ambition. My parents were not at all enthusiastic about this. And they said, well, you know, the other thing that you're interested in is history, and you like buildings. And one of the things that I used to do with my grandfather was go and look at old churches, of which there were a number in the nearby villages. And one of the people I also remember from my early childhood days was a teacher. I had Mr. Dickinson, who was also a cub master, and he, on the weekends, would take us to look at local churches. And I think that was that and my trips with my grandfather really sparked an interest in architecture. And so there was Bishop Crotty, and then the other big formative influence was in taking these acting lessons. I often had to compete in the summer in competitions for reading poetry and small acting classes, which were held in the Royal Pavilion in Brighton. Now, it's a former royal palace, and I think it's fair to describe it as the most exotic building in Europe. And if you can imagine reciting poetry in the dining room of the Royal Pavilion, you perhaps get a sense of how I at an early stage developed a great passion for the exotic. And so that, I think, explains a part of me that makes me a rather odd character. So, in other words, I had a very unusual childhood because of the war, and also because I had two older cousins who went to the same school as I did. One of my eldest cousin, Vernon, was the captain of the school, and he went on to go to Sandhurst, and he became a major in a major regiment, and Colin, and they were both his younger brother, and they were both very athletic, and I was not athletic. I hated games, and I hated gym classes, and I was, I was kind of uninteresting boy by most British standards, because I didn't conform to what was considered to be the way that boys should be, what boys should be interested in. So I was interested in the theatre, and one of the things that was wonderful about living in that area at that time was that the Theatre Royal at Brighton was probably one of the major provincial theatres in Brighton, and it had all of as a teenager, I saw all of the most famous British actors and actors. And it really cemented this great interest in the theatre, which I still have. So I was an odd character, in other words.
Fascinating background and a start to the talk here, David. Do you have warm memories of school? Was it something you enjoyed?
Oh, really, I didn't really enjoy school very much. I did like Mr. Dickinson, who was this teacher who was our cubmaster. And I was also, the other thing that was interesting about my boyhood was that I was a sickly child in many ways. I had 3 major operations, and I had scarlet fever, and I had every major childhood illness except mumps. And so I was often out of school. But what was interesting about Mr. Dickinson was that when I was in the hospital having my tonsils removed, he sent me a letter and was sort of saying how we're really all concerned about you and hope you're doing well, and we really look forward to your coming back. And I was very touched by this. And then when I got back, he asked me to tell the class about my experience of being in the hospital. So he was actually a source of strength to me. And then later on, I had another teacher who taught history, Mr. Williamson, who was from Yorkshire, who was, I think, one of the best early teachers I had, who encouraged my interest in history. And I can remember when I was in school, there was a sort of competition among all of the schools in Brighton for writing a paper on the Regency style. And so I submitted a paper, and I didn't win, but I do remember that he helped me with it. And the headmaster, who I did not much care for, when I graduated from that school, I remember him writing a note saying, I really admired his work on the Regency style, which surprised me. First of all, that he read it, and secondly, that he liked it.
And then that he remembered it. So.
And he remembered, yes.
Interesting story, David. So having attended typical British schools of those period, of which I'm very familiar, how did you make the choice to go to college and choose that particular topic?
Since my parents were so unenthusiastic about my becoming an actor, I thought, well, what they were telling me was, you're interested in building, so why don't you consider becoming an architect? Mm-hmm. And so I met the head of the school, which was at the Brighton College of Arts and Crafts, and I decided that if I'm going to do this, because it's a 5-year professional program, I should start as soon as possible. So I went to college at the age of 16, and I graduated when I was 21, which is not really in these days at all typical. Most British students, of course, go to university or college when they're 18. So in that sense, I was an odd character.
Yeah, and typically it's like I went at 18 and it was a 3-year course. And
yes.
Coming up with a BS at the end of that.
Yes.
So you graduated then around 1956 with a diploma. Was it a diploma or a degree, or what do you end up with from that? A diploma. There we go.
Diploma, yes.
Right.
And so then I got my first job, sort of accidentally landed in the housing division of the London County Council. Now, the London County Council was a very interesting body because it had, at that time, the largest architects department in the world. I think there were well over between 2,000 and 3,000 people who were either architects or planners or somehow in related professions. And of course, if you think of the time, 1956, there was still a massive rebuilding effort going on in London. And housing was really at the center of this. And I had to take a series of exams in order to become registered as an architect. And I wanted to set time aside to prepare for this. And that's how I ended up at the London County Council, because I wanted to work initially for a firm who would give me time to off for about 2 or 3 weeks to study for this exam. And the London County Council said, yes, we'd be happy to do this because we think it's really important for you to be a registered architect. We want you to be a registered architect. So that's how I ended up at the LCC. And then the other great dream I had was I wanted to design a multi-story tower block. And I couldn't, as I look back on this, I can't believe how lucky I was. I got a plum job on a wonderful site called Dacres Road in Sydenham. And it's on the edge of a large 19th century park. And I was the job architect for this. And so, you know, here I was in my early 20s looking after a rather important job. And I learned a lot from being that. And then after that, I became a member of a 3-member team that was responsible for doing the site plan for a huge project on the River Thames called the Royal Victoria Yard, which was a wonderful site. Its historical roots were incredibly rich. It was the place where Sir Walter Raleigh threw down his cloak. So Queen Elizabeth did not step in a puddle. It had cannons on looking out over the Thames, a wonderful series of buildings that were rope stores and rum stores and beautiful 18th century terrace houses. And we tried in our plan to preserve as much of the original structures as possible and then integrate them with new buildings. And I think it was a very successful project. It received a lot of criticism in later years, as many buildings did, many sites of the council did, because of the problems with people living in high-story blocks. But in the context of the time when we designed it, it was a very successful project, and it was a very exciting thing to work on.
A great opportunity for a young man, as you say, to make a mark, career.
Especially when you consider how young I was.
And so you did get your certificate in landscape architecture part-time.
The reason that I got into that program at London University was I realized in working on both of these projects that a large part of what I was doing was landscape design, and my architecture training really hadn't adequately addressed this issue. So I discovered that there was this postgraduate, 2-year postgraduate course at the University of London, and several people I knew were taking this, and they were all architects, and we were all taking it for the same reason, not to become landscape architects, but to become better architects. In other words, to enlarge a toolbox. And this program was run by Peter Youngman, who was a very nice man. He read history at Cambridge, and which he was very proud. And he ran this course, and he had been president of the Institute of Landscape Architects. So he knew all of the leading landscape architects in Great Britain, like Brenda Colvin, Sylvia Crowe, Mary Mitchell and Jeffrey Jellicoe, and he brought them in as to review our designs, which was quite wonderful. And then in the summer months, he would take us on field trips, and we went to see places like Edwin Lutyens' Folly Farm, and we went to a wonderful garden, St. Paul's, Waldenbury, which was where Queen Elizabeth, the Queen Mother, grew up with her brother. And it's a very beautiful early 18th century garden. So that was actually an incredibly rich program, and I learned a lot from Youngman, who was a sort of a low-key person, but incredibly supportive of all of his students. A very, very good teacher in a low-key way.
Was this part-time? Were you fitting this in your regular job? Or?
It was an evening course.
Evening course, okay.
So we met for practically every at University College. It was a lot of fun. I'm glad I did it.
It certainly set you on the path for the future. And so you received the certificate in 1962, I believe, and then you had a career change at that point?
Well, the other thing that we need to work into this, which was sort of a major factor, and I can't really remember why I decided to do this, but there was a competition that was put on by the RIBA, and it was primarily directed towards people who were in their last years of a 5-year program somewhere, but it was also open to people who had graduated. It was a design competition, and it was run by a long classical École des Beaux-Arts line, in which you were given a site, and you were given a program. And during one day, I think it was from about 8 in the morning until 8 at night, you had to come up with a sketch design for this program. And to my surprise, I discovered that I was one of 6 people who were selected to develop their sketch designs into a full-blown set of presentation drawings and a highly refined design, and I won it. So I won the RIBA Victory Scholarship and Silver Medal. Well, one of the advantages of doing this was, in addition to getting a very handsome, solid silver medal, I was able to travel for 2 years. And the first year, I spent 3 months in Scandinavia, spending most of my time in Denmark and Finland, and I met Alvar Aalto and saw a lot of really wonderful buildings. And then the second year, I spent the spring for 3 months in Greece. And I concentrated on traveling among the Greek islands, studying 2 things: classical sites and vernacular villages. And I just had a wonderful time. It sort of fostered a great sense of adventure, of wanting to travel. And I loved it. I think it bucked me up from being a rather shy, sort of hesitant person into being a much more confident man. Hello, the sound is gone. I can't hear you. Hello?
Yeah, especially during those dreary post-war years in England, to be able to get out and explore like that was just an incredible opportunity.
Yes, it was. Yes, yeah.
And so you, at some point around here, you went to the United States to Clemson College, I believe.
Part of the exploration was wanting to travel. And my colleagues at the London County Council couldn't really understand why I was doing this. But in those days, modern architecture the best modern architecture was considered to be in the United States. So I thought, well, I need to, there are a lot of new buildings that I want to see in America. And I had a friend who'd worked with me at the LCC, and he had gone on to come to the United States. He, in very short order, had gone to graduate school at the University of Pennsylvania and become a junior partner of Ian McHogg. So I wrote to him, and he said, "Well, I think you have an inaccurate idea of how complicated seeing all these buildings that you want to see is going to be. It's going to take you years to do this." And he said, "The best thing that you should do is get a job in the United States." And I think, he said, "Given your experience, particularly with that big project on the Thames, which you could classify as urban design, you'll find a number of schools will be really interested in hiring." So he gave me a list of undergraduate programs all on the East Coast. And I wrote to them, and only one of them expressed interest. And that's how I ended up at Clemson, South Carolina, which was actually a surprisingly good school. It was one of the best architecture schools in the South at that time. But the problem was that it was in the South, which was still completely segregated. And while I was there, they accepted their first African-American student, Harvey Gantt, who was a brilliant young man. And it was a great success because he went there really to get a good education, not to make political hay.
Sure.
So then I moved on to Michigan State, and I didn't like Michigan very much, primarily for climatic reasons. And then I thought, well, you've been teaching for 2 years, and it's not a bad occupation, which I'd never thought of myself as being a teacher. And I thought, well, in some ways, teaching is a more interesting occupation than working in an office. So I need to take this seriously. I obviously need an advanced degree. So I had applied to the graduate program at Penn and been accepted, and I ended up there. And Ian McHarg was the founder of the program, was the chair, and was an incredibly charismatic man. He was an inspiring individual, and I had a wonderful time when I was there. And the very first class that I took, which was a plant identification class held at the Morris Arboretum, which is the Arboretum of the University of Pennsylvania, I met 2 of my lifelong friends, Narendra Juneja, who was a brilliant Indian from Delhi, and Carol Levy, who came from a very prominent Philadelphia Jewish family. And one of the things that the tasks we were given in this class was to using keys to identify plants. And so we worked in small teams. And so I accidentally was put with Carol and Narendra, and we had a good time just keying out plants, but also talking about life. And I think Dr. Fogg was somewhat irritated by us because he would say, well, the class needs to come to order if we have the permission of the House of Lords. So we were known as the House of Lords, which you probably appreciate.
I certainly do.
And
so were you working as well? How did you fund your time at college in the United States?
I had made a considerable amount of money at Clemson because the costs of living in a small college town in the South were minimal. So I had a fair bit of money, and I had a graduate teaching scholarship plus money. So I was able to go through the first year of graduate school without having a job. The second year I worked part-time in a small office, and then I continued to work for them for a whole year after I graduated. And they were a very nice group of people, and it was a small office. There were 3 principals, 2 assistants, and a secretary, and they wanted me to stay. But I really was not excited by the things that they were doing. So I thought, well,
Was this landscape work or general architecture?
Yeah.
Landscape architecture. Okay.
And I thought I think it's time to get back into teaching. And this time you need to go to a place where you're going to be physically comfortable. And what that means is it's got to be on the west side of the Rocky Mountains. So what's available? Well, I looked at the map and I looked at the schools, and I thought, well, Berkeley is probably going to be the best place. And so I wrote and offered my services, and I got a very nice letter back from the acting chair at the time, who said, well, unfortunately, we don't have any permanent positions available. However, it's possible that during the coming academic year, we may need someone to come in on a temporary basis to fill in for someone who's on academic leave. So we may be in touch with you. So I think it was about October, I got a telegram from Garrett Ekbo saying there is a position now available. Are you interested? So yes, the rest in a sense is history. That's how I ended up in California, quite accidentally, teaching as a lecturer for almost 4 years. And I fell in love with California. And teaching at Berkeley in those days was a very interesting time to be there, because
Exciting time as well. Right?
The student situation got worse and worse each year I was there. And but I had really good students. The library was fantastic. And I discovered that there was very little work that had been done on the history of California landscape architecture. I thought, well, maybe this is an opportunity. So that's how I started becoming a landscape historian. I had no formal training as a historian. So I'm largely self-taught. Excuse me, I need to turn this off. Sorry. I was supported by a number of small grants from the department. That's how that aspect of my life began. Mm-hmm. And I applied for a tenure-track position at Berkeley. And I was told by the then chairman of the department, Donald Appleyard, he said, no, unfortunately, the only course that we could hire you for is teaching history. And he said, that's not enough to make a career out of. So I think you ought to apply somewhere else. And he said, I will guarantee that I will write a very strong letter of support for you. So at that time, I had a colleague who came to me one day and he said, I've been watching what's been happening to you. And I hope you realize that there is no future for you here. He said, I have just accepted the position of being chair of the department at the University of Washington. And I'd like to hire you. Unfortunately, I don't have a position available at the moment. But if you think you might possibly be interested, I think you should come up and give a lecture before you go off to teach at the University of Edinburgh, which is what I decided to do when I discovered that there was no future at Berkeley. So I came up to Seattle, I gave a lecture. I wasn't terribly excited by the University of Washington because Seattle was in the middle of a major depression. There really was a sign on the freeway which said, will the last person please turn out the lights?
Sure.
It really was there. So I thought, well, I don't know. Maybe this would be an adequate backup plan. So I went off to Edinburgh, and I liked Edinburgh, but I did not get along terribly well with the chairman of the architecture department, who was my immediate boss. I liked my own boss, who was the head of the landscape program, was a wonderful man, H.F. Clark, who was a great scholar, a poet, just a wonderful human being. And I learned a lot from being with him, watching him run graduate seminars in a more scholarly fashion than Ian had done at Penn. And so I thought, well, Edinburgh is clearly not going to work out. So what am I going to do? And at this point, I get a telegram. Position is now available. Are you interested? I ended up in Seattle. And at that time, I had a lady friend who lived in San Francisco. And I was continually flying backwards and forwards. And that really didn't work out. And I thought, well, it's ridiculous to think that it would work out. So eventually I came to terms with living in Seattle and realized that it wasn't such a bad place to be. And that in many ways, I was in a very fortunate position because I was playing a major role in building a department. And so I stayed here. I think the one opportunity that I had for leaving was probably must have been in the late 1970s. There was a position available at Davis, which I applied for. I was shortlisted for it, and apparently I was the runner-up for it. They gave it to somebody else. So at that point, I thought, well, maybe you're going to stay here forever. So I have stayed here forever.
And so just to put it in context, David, it was 1970 when you went up to Washington, right, to start the position there. 71.
71.
71. Okay. So 71, your career is cast for you.
Yes. Now, I was hired to teach regional landscape planning, which I did for several years, and I quite enjoyed it. But I also wanted to teach history. And the history was being taught by one of my colleagues, and it was obvious that he was not going to make way for a younger man. So I thought, well, I've assembled enough information in my work on California to be able to teach another kind of history, which is focused more on the 20th century. So I started for several years to teach a 498 class, which is something that's not part of the regular curriculum, but it's something that a faculty can elect to do on a subject that interests him and that he's well versed in. So I did this for several years, and I remember that one year our program was being accredited, and one of the people on this accreditation team said, you have on your faculty a man who is a very accomplished teacher in history, and you should make this class that he's teaching, you should make it part of your curriculum. So the department did that. And then eventually my colleague, my older colleague retired. And so I was able to teach 2 history classes and then in landscape architecture. And then he'd also started to teach a class in the history of urban design. So I took that over. So at the end of my career, I ended up teaching 3 history classes. And I actually found those more satisfying than teaching studios. Came to the conclusion that I really wasn't a very good studio teacher.
Well, what did you find the difference, studio versus the other format?
Well, I think one of the things that's difficult, at least was for me, in teaching studios is really being able to be supportive of student ideas and helping them develop ideas or discarding something that's inappropriate and selecting something that's more appropriate. I never thought that I was terribly good at that. I think I was actually probably better than I realized. But I found that the lecturing was actually, it was an opportunity for me to be an actor again, as my wife pointed out to me. I complained to her once, and I said, what I really wanted to be was an actor. And she said, well, of course you were an actor. What the hell do you think you were doing when you were acting? You were acting.
So you mentioned your wife, David. At what point did you get married?
Well, that's an interesting story. She was a very remarkable woman. She came from a well-to-do Bay Area family. She was born in Pasadena, and her mother hated living in San Marino, and so they moved back to the Bay Area. She went to school at the Anna Head School, which was a major private girls' school in Berkeley, and then went to school at UC Santa Barbara, and then went to New York. And her parents didn't support her being in New York at all. She came back in, I think, well, I can't remember. But anyway, she lived in San Francisco for several years. And then she got priced out. And she took a design build course at UC Berkeley and worked for a design build firm for 6 years and learned how to build dry stone walls and how to run large estate gardens and so on. And then she got priced out of living in San Francisco, and she moved up to Seattle, and she looked in the summer, the courses being taught at the University of Washington in the summer. And one of them was a course that I taught called The History of Environmental Design in the Pacific Northwest. And she thought, well, that would be really interesting, because I know nothing about this region. So she became a student of mine, and we went out and we hung out quite a bit. And then we got together as a couple as a result of the visit to Seattle of Queen Elizabeth and Prince Philip. I don't know how this was organized, but there was a special faculty convocation at the University of Washington for the Queen and the Prince. And the deal was that all faculty had to attend in their academic regalia. And if you did this, you got 2 free seats. So I thought, well, this will be fun. And so I invited my wife, Madeline, and her friend to come as my guests. Madeline was probably the best dressed woman there. And as my later therapist pointed out to me, she said, well, Madeline was doing 2 things. She recognized the importance of the occasion. She was also saying, look at me. And so we actually became a couple about 2 days after that. And we didn't get married until the reason we didn't get married immediately was that we both had this idea that marriage is about 2 things. It's about property and it's about children. Neither of us wanted to have children because we thought we'd be lousy parents, and we didn't have property. And then something happened, which was the premiums for Madeline's health program went through the roof. And so she knew that the University of Washington had a program for domestic partners. So she went to see them, and they said, well, yes, we do, but it's for same-sex individuals. So Madeline came back and she said, well, I could have a sex change, you could have a sex change, or we could get married. So we got married. And I've told this story to several people, and I said, we got married for singularly unromantic reasons. The response has been, well, actually, no. Giving your wife good health care was a really loving gesture. So don't say that. So we got married, I think in 2006. And it was fortunate because Madeline had quite a lot of health problems at the end, and it didn't leave a huge dent in her finances.
That's quite a story, David. So we're up to 1976 when you married Madeline. What was going on in your career at that time? And did being married change any focus or anything about the direction you were going in?
I think what ended my, I'll tell you what ended my career. Actually, no, I need to back up a little bit. One of the things that I started to do when I arrived at the University of Washington, which was actually very satisfying, was starting study abroad programs. And I was one of the earliest people to do this. So in the summer of 1972, I took a group of students to England, and I did that every other summer until 1986, which was when my mother got seriously sick, and she died the following year. And then I stopped doing that. And then a weird thing happened to me. I was chair of my department for almost 6 years. And when I was stepping down as chair, a small group of students came to me and said, we want you to take us to Rome. And I said, well, no, that doesn't make any sense. I don't like Rome. I had been in Rome in the 1950s, and I hated it. It was dirty, and I thought it was ugly, and all of the museums were in a terrible condition. Of course, I didn't connect all the dots. The reason they were in a poor condition was that Rome was recovering from occupation during the war. It was in terrible shape. Anyway, the University of Washington's architecture department had started a program which happened every autumn quarter called Architecture in Rome. So I said to these students, well, you can participate with the architects in that program, and it's well run, and it has a very good reputation. They said, no, we want you to take us. We don't want to be with the architects. We want our own program. And so rather reluctantly, I ended up taking students to Rome. And I worked incredibly hard that first year. I walked all over Rome. I don't think I've ever walked so much in my entire life. But I got to know Rome through this. And I came to realize that by 1997, Rome had changed dramatically. It looked different, the colors were different. And one of the things that had happened was that Rome decided that they were going to celebrate the millennium by fixing up the city. So they fixed up all of the major museums. They put a lot of money into fixing up major sites like the Campidoglio, and a lot of buildings were cleaned and were restored to their original colors. And what had happened was that in 1870, when Rome became the capital city, the king, the first king of Italy, was the king of Piedmont, who lived in Turin. And he was used to dark northern Italian colors. And so that they'd insisted on erasing the character that Rome had as a southern city. So it was this long process of recovery, which the city undertook, and which was largely finished by the year 2000. So I then took students to Rome from every other year until 2006, and then I had an accident. I broke my elbow, my left elbow, and my right ankle, and it took. That was the last year that I taught, and I permanently damaged my elbow, and I didn't have elbow surgery on it. And so I thought, well, this is probably the best time to retire. So the University of Washington has a really interesting retirement program called 40% rehire, in which when you retire, for 40% of your salary at the time of retirement, you can teach 40% of your teaching assignment. So in that case, it meant 2 classes a year, and you can choose what those classes are. And it was a program that was run out of, is run out of the provost office. So the departments love this because you're a freebie, basically. And so I thought I need to find out more about this program. So I talked to about 7 people who either were in the program or had done it. And I asked them the basic question, what's it like? And what was fascinating was almost every one of them said, you are going to love it. No more committee meetings. You will love it. And this was, in fact, one of the great perks of this program, that all you were required to do was teach. You didn't have to sit on any of these tiresome, tedious committee meetings. And so it was a wonderful way of easing out of full-time teaching. And Madeline and I, by this time, had fallen in love with Italy. So we would go back to Italy as frequently as we could and explore on our own. So we spent a lot of time just hanging out in different Italian cities and looking at villas and gardens and so on.
And so you retired from full-time teaching when, David?
I think this was 2007.
Okay.
And for 5 years, I had 40% rehire.
Right. Now, all along, you've been a prolific writer and publisher. We haven't talked about any of the things that you wrote and covered during that period. The book that I'm most familiar with is the one I started off with, which is the 1994 California Gardens, Creating a New Eden. Tell me about creating a beautiful book like that. How did you go about it?
It had been in the works for a long time, and I can't remember exactly how I discovered Abbeville Press, but the editor that I worked with, who was one of the leading editors, I think was from California, And she was very excited about the idea of doing a book on California gardens. So she steered me through the process, and it was painful at times because so much of of my original drafts had to be completely rewritten. And I got very frustrated, and I thought, well, is this damn book ever going to come out? Well, it did finally come out, and I was fairly pleased with it. So it's an odd story. I think part of the problem was that I was used to academic writing, and this was really a book that was designed for a more popular audience.
Right.
And sort of making that adjustment was not that easy.
So did you have an editor to help you work that, or?
Well, I had this editor at Abbeville
Yeah.
Press.
And okay, so they helped you learn to write in a different style for this audience.
Write in a different style, exactly. Yes.
Sure.
Yeah.
Are there any other major book projects that you worked on during this time?
Well, I am currently working on a number of things. I'm trying to write a history of the Streatfield family, and going back to the Tudor period, bringing it up to the end of the 19th century. I'm also thinking of writing a short book which would about the house which Madeline and I restored, and the garden which we created together, and it's really which will be a tribute to her because she was the gardener. I'm really just the custodian of this thing. But in some ways, I see this as a tribute to a very successful marriage and partnership, and something that is, I think, a thing of great beauty and serenity, and the difficulty of dealing with her death and now being alone and facing my own death is made a lot easier by living where I am. In a house and a garden that are just rich with wonderful memories.
Can you tell us a little bit about the garden? How big is it? What's
Well,
the design?
It's two city lots, so it's a total of 8,000 square feet. The house sits on the northern lot, and the other lot has a huge madrone tree in it. It's said to be the drones are in serious decline in Seattle, but this one is considered to be one of the most healthy in the city. We sit on the edge of a steep hill, so the house is, when you look at it from the street, it's 2 stories. It's 4 stories at the back, which gives you a sense of how much it slopes down.
Slows down. Yeah.
Planted a lot of trees. We started the garden, I think, in the mid-1990s, so it's sort of really come into its maturity now. And this year, right now, I don't think it's ever looked as beautiful as it does right at this very moment. So it's
Seattle's famous for rhododendrons and similar plants. Do you have
species rhododendrons in our garden? Yeah.
And is there much hardscape, or is it?
There's virtually no hardscape. There is an area that we call the gravel pit, which is our entertainment area in front of the front door, and it has 3 seats in it, and we sit out there a lot and invite our friends over, and it's shaded, and it's just a lovely space, and it's a beautiful place to look out into the garden. And one of my favorite places to sit is in the evenings, is a place where I can watch the dying light, and I can see the water and the sound off in the distance, and see the big madrone tree. It's paradise.
Sounds gorgeous, gorgeous. Do you have other favorite gardens around Seattle that you'd take visitors to see when they come to town?
Well, I quite like the Bloedel Reserve. I've taken a lot of students there, and it's changed a great deal. There used to be a wonderful garden called the Walker Rock Garden in West Seattle, which I think is now in very poor condition. But it was an incredible story. It was done by a man who worked for the Boeing company, a rather low-level engineer. He had a regular daily job, and he created this garden on a fairly small. In some ways, it's rather like our garden, the house, and then an unbuilt lot, where he created his garden. And he gathered rocks from all over the state of Washington and created structures out of these rocks. And it's a sort of fantasy. It's somewhat like the that garden in Los Angeles that was created by that crazy man.
Oh, the big tall tower.
Yeah, with the big tall towers. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. Yeah.
And it's not as ambitious as that, but it's in the same spirit of fantasy and realizing a fantasy.
How about California gardens? What are your favorite gardens in California, other than Point Lobos that you mentioned earlier, a natural garden?
Well, I love Thomas Church's Donnell Garden.
Yes, of course.
And a garden that Lawrence Halpern created. For, one of the daughters of Mrs. Roth, Filoni.
Mm-hmm.
And it's a beautiful Halpern, I think one of Halpern's finest gardens. I like Filoni, although I wish in a way that it was maintained more in the spirit of Mrs. Roth, which I can remember when she was still living there, that the kitchen garden was effectively a working garden. It didn't have these show areas in it. And I think, that's a vanished life, and it has a potential real value to people to see something like that.
Yes. Yeah.
So in that sense, I think that they've made a mistake trying to make more demonstration gardens.
Yeah. Yeah. More like a Hollywood set in some ways than a garden you live in.
Yeah. I mean, it was productive space, and it should have been kept as productive space.
Interesting.
Then there's Lotus Land in Santa Barbara, which I always like for its fantasy elements.
The theatrical garden indeed should appeal to you, David, with your acting. You were, I believe, at one point working on a book on Lockwood de Forest.
Yes, I still am.
Still working on that?
Yeah. Trying to find the right publisher now is the problem.
Okay. And any other books that you're working on other than the Streatfield family and DeForest?
That's it. That's enough.
Plenty to keep you busy these days.
Going, yeah.
So if you had to choose one project that you worked on throughout your career to tell us about, what would that have been?
It's probably my own house and garden.
Okay.
We had a lot of fun fixing up the house. It was a rundown arts and crafts house, which it's not a true restoration, but we tried to take it back to something close to what it had been. One of the big differences is that it has double glazing throughout, which made a huge change on an improvement on a heating bill.
Sure.
And then the back part of the garden was an absolute wilderness. It had been neglected for something like 20 years. So it took us at least 5 years to get the weeds under control. And then we were able finally to rebuild it. And there was a big storm in the actual day that Bill Clinton was inaugurated for his first term. There was a 100-mile-an-hour storm that blew down our street and knocked over 3 trees in our front garden. And the insurance paid for a new sidewalk. And so Madeline said, well, this is good material. We're not going to let this go to waste. So she took a sledgehammer and she knocked all of these big slabs of old concrete into smaller, more manageable pieces. And all of the walls in our garden were built from the old sidewalk. So
great reuse of materials there.
Use of material, yes. And there's an important lesson there that don't waste anything.
Looking back, David, are there any roads that you didn't take that you look back wistfully and say, boy, I'd really like to have tried that?
No, no, there are not. I recently, courtesy of Zoom, saw the actor Bill Nye talking with some of his other fellow actors. He said having regrets is not a good place to go to. Yeah, he's right. He's right. So, no, I have no regrets at all. I realize that I've had a rather odd career, but actually, in retrospect, it's been a satisfying. I've met some amazing people, some of whom were my students. I mean, I've had some incredible students, like Christy being one of them.
Any other people that you met along the way that you haven't mentioned that played an important role somewhere in your career?
Let's see, I think I've mentioned Bishop Crotty,
Yeah.
Frank Clark, who I worked with, I worked under at Edinburgh University, was a major figure whom I admired a great deal for his modesty. And I think one of the lessons I learned from him is that you don't have to be flamboyant and shout from the rooftops all the time to get attention. You can do really good work very quietly.
And be recognized for that, for sure. Absolutely.
Yeah.
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 So if somebody, young person, came to you today and said, I want a future in landscape architecture, what advice and direction would you give them?
Well, I would say, remember that this is it's being defined as the art and science of landscape design, and that's, I think, is a correct definition. But I think what often gets lost is that it's a service profession. You're making improvements to the environment for other people, and it should not become a vehicle for self-expression. And I think there's a real danger in, and I've seen this among a number of students who see this as an opportunity to make a major mark, which is their expression of themselves, rather than looking to find change, opportunities for change, which are going to improve the quality of lives of other people. And that takes me back to one of the things that I learned when I worked at the London County Council. Here I was, a child of middle-class parents, coming from a solid middle-class background, designing environments for people who were poor for the most part, who were tenants. And they had different values. And that was one of the biggest things that I learned from that experience of 6 years working there, was trying to find ways of harnessing my creative abilities as a designer at the service of people whose whole way of life and whose objectives were totally different from mine. And I think that's a problem that all designers still face frequently. So that's something that I think all students, whatever field they're in, but particularly for landscape architect, need to be aware of, to be sensitive to who you are designing for, and not brushing aside differences, but trying to explore differences.
Sure. I mean, it's important advice for any public position, especially a bureaucrat, in terms of ordering our lives without understanding what our lives are about.
Yes, absolutely.
Okay, well, do you have anything else you'd like to tell us that you think our readers would be interested in?
I don't think so.
I think we've covered a fascinating career, David, and it's been wonderful hearing.
Good one.
No, you talk about it being odd. It looks like you planned this thing out perfectly
Oh,
from the age of 6 or 7.
interesting is that there was no plan.
I
And I
understand.
thought about this when I was preparing for this interview. I thought, there was no grand plan. I know some people have this idea that by this age in my career, I want to be here and I want to have done this.
Right.
None of that was true in my case. There was
Well, I mean, there was no grand plan, but it turns out there was a great design, and I congratulate you on your success in carrying it off. And we all get great pleasure from a lot of the work you've done and added to our society. So, well, if you ever come up to Point Lobos,
Yes,
do let me know. I'd love to show you around some of my favorite spots there. I've been researching it quite a bit recently because a lot of people claim that Robert Louis Stevenson borrowed bits of it for the design of Treasure Island.
Yes, yes.
And in fact, we've come across something written by his stepdaughter-in-law where she claimed very specifically that was the case. So love to show you Spyglass Hill one day.
Yes, I'd love to see that. I always thought that the inspiration for it was the garden where he lived in Edinburgh, where there's an island, there's a little island in the middle of it. That, here was this child, who was this man remembering his childhood fantasies?
It's so like John Steinbeck was the same. He borrowed a little piece for here, a little piece for there, and then he created a world of his own. Yes. And certainly.
So that's what all great creative artists do.
Absolutely. So, well, thank you very much for joining us today. I've enjoyed talking with you, and good luck on maintaining your garden in the splendor that it sounds. So, thank you.